Stop everything. Before you hit play, before you even settle in, you need to understand the stakes. This isn't just a kingdom. This is the story of a civilization born not just on a fault line, but as the fault line itself. A towering, defiant mountain range called Armenia, that the greatest empires on earth spent 3,000 years trying to flatten, trying to erase, trying to swallow whole. Can you believe a single nation, constantly crushed between the hammers of East and West, Rome and Persia, Greeks and Arabs, could somehow survive long enough to change the very map of human spirituality? It seems impossible, a geopolitical miracle. But this is the unbelievable, true history of Hayastan, the land of the braves. Imagine a high plateau, rugged and unforgiving, crowned by the terrifying dormant majesty of Mount Ararat. This land, known to the ancients as Urartu, was the ultimate crossroads, the historical equivalent of a traffic accident where every single superpower had to pass through, leaving behind ruin and fire. For centuries, the people who would become the Armenians were merely names whispered in the terrifying annals of the Assyrian Empire, a machine of conquest and terror that viewed this mountain realm as nothing more than an inexhaustible source of iron, horses, and slaves. They didn't just fight wars, they executed genocidal campaigns designed to silence the mountains forever. Yet the mountains always spoke back. This was the ancient heartbeat, the Proto-Armenian spirit that refused to kneel to the brutal splendor of Nineveh. Even as the Assyrian war machine ground everything to dust, forcing kings to grovel and cities to burn, a core identity was solidifying high above the plains, fueled by the volcanic heat of their homeland. Then came a catastrophe no one saw coming, an epical shift that changed the entire power structure of the Near East, the fall of Assyria. It was a moment of fleeting, desperate hope, quickly snatched away by even greater giants. When the Medes and the Babylonians finally dismantled the Assyrian terror, Armenia simply became a new prize. They traded one brutal overlord for another, finding themselves pulled inexorably into the orbit of the rising Achaemenid Persian Empire, a colossus so vast, so powerful, that its shadow stretched from India to the Aegean Sea. This was the era of Darius the Great, the King of Kings, who saw Armenia not as an independent realm, but as satrapy 13th and 18th, a vital strategic buffer zone, a treasury of gold, and a provider of the finest cavalry the world had ever known. To challenge this behemoth was suicide. To obey it was cultural suffocation. Yet, within this seemingly iron grip, something extraordinary was happening. The Persians, pragmatic rulers that they were, relied on local nobility to administer these far-flung territories. And in Armenia, this meant the rise of the Yervanduni dynasty, the Orontids. These weren't mere puppets. They were shrewd survivors, masters of the delicate, deadly dance required to serve a great king, while simultaneously building their own sovereign power base. They intermarried with Persian nobility, adopted Persian administrative techniques, and learned the language of empire, all while maintaining the fiercely distinct cultural markers of their people. This slow, methodical accumulation of power, hidden beneath the veneer of obedience, was the first great masterstroke of Armenian statecraft. They were waiting, patiently, for the moment of imperial weakness, the fatal flaw in the Persian armor. It was a high-stakes gamble, played out over generations, where one wrong move meant instant execution and the utter annihilation of their nascent independence. The world was watching, specifically the ambitious satraps vying for the throne, and the unpredictable Greeks who were starting to cause trouble in the West. The Persian Empire seemed invincible, but history is rarely tidy. Then came the first tremors of collapse, delivered not by rival kings, but by a desperate, starving army of mercenary Greeks, known to history as the 10,000. Led by the historian and general Xenophon, these battle-hardened survivors marched straight through the heart of Armenia in 401 BC, facing not just the Persian satraps, but the fierce, nearly unconquerable local tribes who saw them as invaders. Xenophon's chilling accounts of the Armenian highlands, the treacherous snows, the underground villages, the strange, potent barley wine, provide the first clear external look at this resilient society, highlighting their unique customs and their ferocious resistance to outsiders, regardless of who commanded them. This chaotic march demonstrated two critical truths. First, the Persian grip on the highlands was tenuous, and second, the Armenians possessed an inherent, localized power structure capable of mobilizing resistance faster than the central government. The seed of true separation had been planted. But the true earthquake, the one that shattered the Achaemenid world forever, arrived in the form of a single, unstoppable man, Alexander the Great. His whirlwind conquest of Asia in the 330s BC was the ultimate reset button for the ancient world, and Armenia, located directly in the path of this seismic shift, had to decide instantly: fight and be obliterated, or negotiate and survive. The Urantids chose the path of sophisticated pragmatism. They did not foolishly throw their entire strength against the Macedonian phalanx. Instead, they recognized the inevitable and managed to secure a special status, paying tribute but maintaining internal autonomy. This calculated surrender, this masterpiece of diplomatic survival, allowed the Armenians to avoid the worst of Alexander's wrath, preserving their nobility and their ancient governmental structures, while the rest of the Persian Empire dissolved into chaos and fragmented into warring Greek successor states. The world became Hellenistic, drenched in Greek culture and Greek ambition. And suddenly, the Urantids found themselves in a unique position, the last surviving, legitimate dynasty from the Persian era, presiding over a strategically vital region caught between the massive Seleucid Empire to the south and the restless, barbarian tribes to the north. The struggle for true independence had just begun, and the stage was set for the arrival of a figure so colossal so ambitious that he would momentarily create an Armenian empire stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean. This was the world of high-stakes maneuvering, a geopolitical powder keg ready to explode into the glorious, bloody age of the Artaxiads. This is where the foundation stone was laid, but the true kingdom required a king willing to challenge Rome itself. Get ready. The stage had been set, the powder keg loaded, but a nation needs a lightning rod, a single force to channel that chaotic energy into a destiny forged in iron. That man was Artaxias I, the architect of a kingdom that refused to bow, pulling Armenia out of the collapsing shadow of the Seleucid Empire in the early 2nd century BC. He didn't just inherit a title, he seized a geopolitical inferno and declared it home. This was not a slow transition. This was a violent, necessary break from the successors of Alexander the Great, who had long treated Armenia as a provincial ATM. Artaxias was a satrap turned sovereign, a military commander who understood that true independence required more than just defiant declarations. It required borders that could bleed but not break. He systematically defined the edges of his nascent kingdom, consolidating the Armenian highlands into a coherent, defensible state, preparing for the colossal powers already circling like vultures. He looked at the vast, high plateau, a land where every valley was a fortress and every mountain pass a potential graveyard for invaders, and knew exactly where his heart of power must lie. This vision culminated in one of the most astonishing partnerships in ancient history, linking the fate of the emerging Armenian Kingdom to the final, desperate genius of a dying superpower. Imagine this. Artaxias needed a capital, a true royal seat that screamed permanence and defiance. And who arrives in this remote corner of the world, fleeing the long, vengeful shadow of Rome? None other than Hannibal Barca, the living legend, the Carthaginian general who had brought the mighty republic to its knees and still lived to tell the tale. Hannibal, now a political refugee, offered his expertise to the rising king. It's an unbelievable twist of fate. The greatest military mind Rome ever faced helped lay the foundation for the kingdom that would one day challenge Rome's eastern dominion. He advised Artaxias on the perfect location for a city that could withstand any siege and control all trade routes. The result was Artaxata, the joy of Artaxias, built on a strategically vital peninsula formed by the river Araxes. It was designed to be beautiful, defensible, and absolutely impenetrable. A dagger pointed at the heart of any empire seeking passage through the highlands. Artaxata became the symbol of early Armenian defiance, a masterpiece of Hellenistic planning adapted to the harsh realities of the Armenian terrain. And it stood as a monument to the king who dared to consult the devil of Rome's nightmares. Artaxias, I solidified the kingdom, but it was his successors who had to navigate the truly terrifying waters. To the east, the Achaemenid ghosts of Persia were replaced by the volatile, aggressive power of the Parthians, master horse archers who treated the vast plains as their personal hunting grounds. To the west, the Seleucid carcass was finally picked clean, leaving a terrifying void that was rapidly being filled by the inexorable march of Roman legions. Armenia was not just a spectator. It was the ultimate high-stakes chessboard. For decades, the Artaxiads played a delicate, dangerous game of political alignment, leaning on whichever power was momentarily weaker, always balancing on the knife edge between subjugation and survival. They learned the brutal truth. Geography was their shield, but ambition was their curse. This dangerous balancing act would eventually demand a king whose ambition was so vast, so blinding, that he would shatter the balance entirely and attempt to create an empire stretching from sea to shining sea. And his origin story is one of utter humiliation, a fire that burned the desire for vengeance into his very soul. Enter Tigranes II, known to history as Tigranes the Great. But before he was great, he was chattel. As a young man, Armenia, during a period of weakness, had been forced to surrender him as a political hostage to the very Parthians they sought to avoid. He spent years in the court of the King of Kings, forced to witness the swagger and power of his captors, absorbing the lessons of imperial dominance, while his pride withered. The price for his release was brutal. He had to cede 70 valleys, prime territory, to the Parthian Empire, a humiliating surrender of the lands his ancestors had bled for. Imagine the internal rage, the promise he made to himself as he finally rode back into the Armenian highlands, a king in waiting who had paid a king's ransom in land and dignity. He inherited the crown in 95 BC, and the world was about to understand the difference between a king and a king of kings. Tigranes was not merely a survivor. He was a storm waking to break. He immediately set about turning Armenia's political and military structure into a war machine honed by years of bitterness. His first act was to crush the small regional kingdoms and principalities, consolidating every last piece of the Armenian plateau under his absolute command. The Highlanders, ferocious and loyal, became the core of an army that utilized both native cavalry prowess and highly effective Hellenistic-style infantry formations. The debt owed to Parthia was the first to be repaid, with interest. Tigranes marched east, reclaiming the ceded valleys and then plunging deep into Parthian territory, capturing Media Atropatene, and reducing the mighty Parthian King of Kings to begging for peace. Where Armenia had once surrendered land, it now dictated terms, humiliating the very men who had held its monarch captive. But Tigranes' vision did not stop at mere self-defense or regional dominance. He looked west and south, seeing the collapsing Seleucid remnants in Syria, the fragmented states of Cilicia, and the wealthy Mediterranean ports ripe for the taking. This was his moment, the chaotic historical vacuum he was born to fill. In a breathtaking campaign that defied all expectations of a mountain kingdom, Tigranes swept through Mesopotamia, conquered Syria, seized control of the vital trade routes and absorbed the ancient kingdom of Commagene. Suddenly, the Armenian Empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean coast, a massive, powerful entity that encompassed multiple peoples, languages, and strategic choke points. He adopted the title that signaled his immense power, Shahan Shah, King of Kings, traditionally reserved only for the Persian emperors. This was the pinnacle. Armenia was no longer a buffer state, no longer a pawn. It was the absolute middle ground, controlling the destiny of the entire Near East. To solidify this glorious, terrifying expansion, Tigranes demanded a new capital, one that could house the vast wealth and glory of his multi-ethnic empire. Artaxata was magnificent, but Tigranes demanded hubris. He demanded Tigranortica, the city of Tigranes. Built in the sun-drenched plains of northern Mesopotamia, Tigranocerta was designed to be the administrative and cultural center of the world, filled with imported Greek artists, enormous parks, theaters, and a massive palace. It was a statement of permanent dominion, a monument so grand it screamed defiance at the gods themselves. But in history, hubris always carries an astronomical price tag. Tigranes had carved an empire out of the chaos, but he had failed to heed one crucial lesson. The Roman Republic did not tolerate rivals. As Tigranes II sat on his throne in Tigranocerta, accepting the submission of Syrian kings and Jewish princes, the shadow of Rome was stretching eastward, led by generals who craved glory and land. And when the ultimate eastern threat, Mithridates VI of Pontus, needed an ally in his final, desperate war against the Roman machine, he ran directly into the arms of the one man powerful enough to protect him, Tigranes the Great. The most dangerous alliance in the ancient world was formed, sealing the fate of the Armenian Empire in a catastrophic collision with the might of the legions. The stage was set for the greatest, bloodiest chapter of Armenian history, one that would redefine survival itself. The world held its breath as the impossible happened. The invincible shield of Tigranes the Great shattered against the granite will of Rome. Lucullus, the cunning general, had not just defeated an army. He had ripped the heart out of an empire, storming the magnificent capital of Tigranocerta itself. The city, built to symbolize the global dominance of Armenia, fell in a single brutal day, a testament to the speed and efficiency of the Roman war machine. The treasures seized were unimaginable, enough to flood the Roman economy and forever cement the legend of the Armenian king's wealth. Tigranes, stripped of his crown jewels but not his fighting spirit, was forced into a humiliating retreat, watching his hard-won territories crumble like dust beneath the hobnailed boots of the legions. This was not the end, though. It was merely the excruciating beginning of Armenia's next, most terrifying phase of existence. Tigranes understood that being defeated did not mean being annihilated. He became the ultimate pawn master, even while utterly vanquished. He leveraged his defeat, understanding the geopolitical fault lines of his realm better than any Roman strategist. Rome, for all its might, could not afford to hold this vast, mountainous terrain indefinitely, especially with the ravenous Parthian Empire constantly sniffing around its eastern flank, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
Tigranes knew that Armenia was not just a landmass. It was a buffer, a required sacrifice zone. He negotiated not as a king demanding terms, but as a crucial component of the entire Asian balance of power, a necessary evil that Rome required to keep the Parthians at bay. The treaty signed with Pompey the Great, Lucullus's successor, was not a final surrender. It was a miraculous, if severely reduced, resurrection.
The greatest empire the world had ever known had been forced to recognize the necessity of the Armenian state, even in its broken form. The alternative was a direct, endless war with Parthia, a conflict that would drain the resources of the Mediterranean world. Armenia became the hinge of destiny, perpetually caught between two monumental forces, always required but never truly independent.
For the next 3 centuries, Armenia became the most contested chessboard in antiquity. Its crown became a political football, kicked back and forth between the two titans, the eagles of Rome and the horse archers of Parthia. The Armenian throne was occupied by a succession of rulers who had to possess the political agility of a tightrope walker, balancing over a chasm of fire, constantly assessing the slightest shift in imperial wind direction. It was during this endless imperial tug-of-war that the Arsacid dynasty finally took root in Armenia. This dynasty was related to the ruling house of Parthia, providing a strong cultural and familial link to the East. Yet they skillfully maintained enough independence to avoid being completely swallowed by their eastern cousins or totally annexed by the West. This duality was their armor and their curse. The tension exploded most dramatically during the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero, a man known for his histrionics and his burning ambition to prove his military prowess. Nero demanded absolute loyalty, but the current Armenian king, Tigranes I, was decidedly pro-Parthian, installed by his own brother, the Parthian king Vologases. This was an insult Nero could not abide. Rome poured massive military resources into the east, armies marching across mountains previously thought impassable, determined to settle the Armenian question once and for all. It was an exercise in pure, brutal hubris. The resulting war was a brutal, protracted conflict of scorched earth and deadly ambushes, culminating in the masterful Parthian strategy at the Battle of Rhandaea in 62 AD, an absolute disaster for the legions. The Romans suffered a humiliating defeat, forcing the mighty empire of the West to finally accept a compromise they had desperately tried to avoid. They had to swallow their pride and acknowledge the strategic reality that military conquest alone could not secure the high ground of the Armenian plateau. The subsequent treaty was an absolute masterpiece of diplomatic maneuvering by the Armenian and Parthian forces.
The terms agreed upon were astonishing, a testament to the stubborn resilience of the Arsacid state. Tiridates I would travel all the way to Rome, a massive journey of political theater, to receive his crown directly from Nero's hands. This satisfied Roman pride, symbolizing Rome's ultimate suzerainty and allowing Nero to stage a magnificent, face-saving spectacle for the masses.
But the critical clause was that the Arsadid king would remain on the throne, meaning Armenia would be ruled by an ethnic Parthian royal house, yet politically sanctioned by Rome. The king of Armenia wore two crowns simultaneously, one facing east, one facing west. This fragile, impossible balancing act defined the state for 2 more centuries, ensuring its continued, albeit battered, existence. Armenia was perpetually fractured, often experiencing devastating invasions from both sides. Yet its core identity, its royal structure, and its mountainous heartland remained unbroken. Every time Rome tried to install a purely Roman puppet, or Parthia, and later the ruthless Sasanian Persian Empire, tried to enforce total assimilation, the mountains themselves seemed to rise up in defiance, spitting out the invaders into the valleys below. Through all this geopolitical chaos, the Arsacid kings maintained the ancient Armenian nobility, the Nakarars, a powerful class of regional lords whose loyalty was often conditional, making the king's job a constant negotiation of power rather than absolute rule. This decentralized strength, ironically, was another factor in the nation's survival, ensuring that no single invasion could decapitate the entire country instantly. The king might fall, but the localized power structure, rooted in the ancient clans, would always endure. This system provided a resilience that flat, centralized empires could never possess. The stage was now set, not for military glory, but for a revolution of the soul, a spiritual earthquake far greater than any clash of legions that had come before. While the Persian fire cults and the Roman gods battled for supremacy in the great capitals, a new, forbidden faith was slowly seeping into the high valleys of Armenia. It was a secret, dangerous movement, one that spoke of martyrdom, devotion, and a single, all-powerful God. This faith would soon collide violently with the ancient pagan traditions of the court. The final great act of resistance would not be fought with iron and bronze, but with faith and unwavering commitment to a new deity. The man who would trigger this transition, Gregory the Illuminator, was not a general or a king, but a political prisoner, a man of profound suffering and even more profound conviction. His arrival signaled the end of one age of defiance and the beginning of another, one that would transform the very definition of Armenian identity forever. The year 301 AD was rapidly approaching, and the history of the world was about to be rewritten on the rugged slopes of Mount Ararat. The world was holding its breath. 2 colossal empires, Rome and Persia, were locked in a death grip right on Armenia's border. And the stakes were no longer just about land. They were ideological, spiritual, and utterly existential. This tiny kingdom,
wedged between civilization's titans, was about to make a choice so radical it would shatter its ancient foundations and redefine geopolitics for 1,000 years. The Zoroastrian fires of the Sassanid Persian Empire were burning hotter than ever before, demanding absolute allegiance and stamping out anything that smacked of Roman influence or, far worse, the insidious creep of monotheism. King Tigranes III, a colossal figure of Armenian strength, was initially a Roman ally, trained in the legions, a man whose word was law and whose temper was legendary, a true product of the ancient pagan world. He represented the old guard, the fervent worship of Atamazd, the deep reverence for the sacred temples, and the absolute necessity of maintaining cultural purity against overwhelming foreign pressure to ensure the continued survival of the Arsacid dynasty. But even the mightiest monarchs cannot stop a flood of new ideas once the dam has broken. Then the dangerous whisper began. A man named Grigor, educated in Caesarea, a descendant of the very family who had assassinated Tigranes' father, was spreading a subversive new religion right under the king's nose. This wasn't just heresy in a religious sense. Politically, it was treason, a deadly threat to the fragile stability of a nation balancing on a geopolitical razor's edge. Tigranes saw the new faith, Christianity, not as salvation, but as a treacherous dagger aimed straight at the heart of the state. It was a Trojan horse carrying Roman cultural influence, or perhaps worse, a philosophy that preached loyalty to a higher, unseen king than Tigranes himself, undermining the divine mandate of the crown. The persecution that followed was utterly brutal, a terrifying, systematic attempt to crush the burgeoning movement before it could take root in the fertile, ancient soil of the Armenian highlands. The king's reaction was swift, ruthless, and designed to send a chilling message to every corner of his precarious domain. Tigranes, driven by mounting political paranoia and perhaps a misguided sense of cosmic duty to his ancestors, ordered the execution of Grigor. But simple execution was deemed too quick, too merciful for a traitor who threatened the very fabric of Armenian identity and the centuries of pagan tradition. Instead, Gregory was thrown into the Khor Virap, the deep pit, a subterranean dungeon, a natural well infested with venomous snakes and scorpions, designed not just to kill, but to erase all trace of the victim. He was left there, supposedly for a slow, agonizing death by starvation and venomous bite, to suffer beneath the very ground he had tried to convert. Years passed, and the fate of the man in the pit became a haunting, forbidden legend, a silent challenge to the pagan gods and the king who served them. The kingdom continued its turbulent existence, fighting skirmishes, negotiating tenuous treaties, desperately pretending that the darkness below was irrelevant to the sunlight above. But fate, or perhaps divine intervention, had a far more dramatic destiny prepared for the king and his kingdom. Then came the ultimate turning point, a moment so bizarre, so profoundly dramatic,
It has been immortalized in the annals of history and legend forever. A terrifying, debilitating, divine affliction struck King Tigranes III himself. The king, the mighty warrior who had faced down Persian cavalry and Roman legions, began to behave not like a man, but like a wild boar, tearing off his royal robes, rooting in the mud, consumed by a terrible, inexplicable ailment that defied every physician and priest in the entire realm. The kingdom immediately descended into absolute panic and chaos. The gods were clearly angered, but who knew why? The greatest healers of the ancient world were urgently summoned. Ancient rituals were performed with desperate precision, but the king remained a beast, a terrifying, slobbering symbol of chaos consuming the state from the very top. It was the king's deeply pious sister, Khosrow-Dukt, who finally received the revelation, a vision clear and horrifyingly specific. Only the man surviving in the pit, Grigor, could possibly heal the king and restore order to the shattered kingdom. Imagine the sheer, terrifying spectacle. The royal guards, trembling with fear and disbelief, descending into the venomous darkness, expecting only a pile of dust and bones. But after 13 years of unimaginable suffering, Gregory miraculously emerged, pale and weak, but undeniably alive, sustained only by the piety of a local Christian woman who had secretly lowered bread to him. He was brought before the raving monarch, not as a broken prisoner seeking clemency, but as the only improbable hope. Gregory, instead of demanding vengeance for his years of torment, began the process of healing, preaching not condemnation, but the boundless power of forgiveness and the new God. The healing was instantaneous, miraculous, and irreversible. Tigranes III was restored, rising from the dirt a changed man, humbled by the immense power he had witnessed. The political calculation, the ideological struggle, the pagan past, all were instantly overshadowed by this undeniable, earth-shattering miracle. The king, the brutal persecutor, the man who had tossed Gregory into the abyss, made the most seismic, momentous decision in all of Armenian history. He didn't just tolerate Christianity, he embraced it, violently, completely, and immediately, transforming his entire realm overnight. In 301 AD, decades before Rome itself would officially adopt the cross, the Armenian Kingdom stood up on its rugged mountains and declared itself the first nation-state to accept Christianity as its state religion. This wasn't a gentle, gradual transition. It was a revolution enforced by the crown, a tectonic spiritual shift demanding immediate allegiance from every single lord, soldier, and peasant. The temples of Anahit and Vahagn were instantly shuttered, their priceless idols shattered, replaced by hastily constructed wooden crosses and baptismal fonts carved into the ancient rock. This act was pure, unadulterated defiance, a massive ideological middle finger extended simultaneously to the pagan Roman legions in the West
and the zealous Zoroastrian Sassanids in the east. Armenia had found its ultimate shield, its defining characteristic, the eternal fire that would fuel its survival against all odds. They had exchanged the transient, unreliable alliances of empire for an eternal, unwavering covenant, setting themselves utterly apart in a world that demanded political and spiritual conformity. The geopolitical fault line had not just survived the intense pressure, it had crystallized, permanently transforming its strategic vulnerability into an ironclad, unique spiritual identity. The struggle for survival was now simultaneously political, military, and holy, ensuring that the battles fought on the fields would forever be remembered as righteous wars for the very soul of the Armenian nation.
The implications were terrifyingly immense, forcing them into a new existential conflict that would last for the next 16 centuries. The drama, the impossible survival story, had only just begun its most challenging chapter.
The world had just witnessed the greatest military force in history, the colossal Hellenistic Empire founded by Alexander, dissolve into infighting, leaving a gaping, bloody void. This was not chaos. This was supreme opportunity. And from the ashes of the Seleucid giant, a new native power was finally ready to assert its destiny. The Artaxiad dynasty, forged in the crucible of absolute defiance, stood up and declared that Armenia would no longer be a footnote in anyone else's history. Their goal was simple, yet utterly insane: to consolidate the fractured Armenian lands, unite the scattered clans, and declare independence not just from distant overlords, but from the very concept of foreign rule. They knew the price of this unprecedented ambition would be paid in rivers of blood, but the taste of freedom was too sweet to resist the danger. They established their first truly grand capital, Artaxata, built on a strategically imposing peninsula, designed to be a permanent symbol of their permanence. For a time, the Seleucids were too busy eating their own tail to notice the rising power in the north, granting Armenia a precious few decades of growth. But merely existing was not enough for the mountain kings. They understood that in this brutal geopolitical arena, the only way to ensure survival was not to hide, but to become too formidable to ignore. And then, history delivered the man who would prove this theory true beyond all rational expectation: the King of Kings, Tigranes the Great. This man, whose very name meant fighting with an arrow, looked at the map of the known world around 95 BC and decided it simply wasn't big enough for his ambition. He didn't just rule his mountain domain, he consumed the neighboring regions in a terrifying display of military and diplomatic genius. He seized control of Commagene and Syria, pushed his borders south until he reached the warm, deep waters of the Mediterranean Sea, and forced even the mighty Parthian Shahs, who were supposed to be the undisputed masters of the East, to bow down.
and call him their superior. Suddenly, the tiny, isolated mountain kingdom that everyone expected to eventually crumble had become the dominant superpower of the entire Middle East, commanding an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea deep into the Levant and across the borders of Roman Anatolia. This wasn't just survival. This was conquest on a scale no one had foreseen from this rugged land. Tigranes had built his spectacular new capital, Tigranocerta, the city of Tigranes, to be the jewel of the world, a city so magnificent it was meant to mock every rival capital, a place filled with Hellenistic culture and unimaginable wealth, secured behind walls reaching over 75 feet high. But history has an unforgiving sense of balance. When a power rises this high, this fast, it inevitably catches the eye of something far colder and hungrier than any neighboring king. The shadow of Rome, the unstoppable, disciplined, world-devouring republic, was now falling across Armenia's blindingly bright, sunlit empire. The conflict was less an accident and more a gravitational inevitability. Tigranes, in an act of breathtaking defiance, had sheltered Rome's most wanted eastern enemy, the constantly scheming Mithridates VI of Pontus, an action Rome viewed as a direct declaration of war against the entire civilized world order. General Lucullus, the ruthless master of logistics and one of Rome's most formidable commanders, marched his legions into the Armenian heartland, dragging the full weight of Roman fury behind him. The arrogance of Tigranes in this moment was staggering. He believed his mountains, his vast armies, and his legendary cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry, were invincible. When Lucullus's forces were reportedly approaching the majestic walls of Tigranocerta, the King of Kings famously dismissed the size of the Roman army, calling them with utter contempt, "Too few for an army, too many for an embassy." He thought his numerical superiority was an unbreachable shield. He was catastrophically wrong. The ensuing Battle of Tigranocerta in 69 BC was not just a defeat. It was a devastating, empire-shattering massacre. The technologically superior, highly organized, and ruthlessly motivated Roman legions tore through the vast but less disciplined Armenian forces like paper wrapping. The grand city of Tigranocerta, built with the expectation of lasting 1,000 years, fell almost immediately. Its immense treasures plundered, its imperial dreams extinguished in a single brutal afternoon. Tigranes the Great was utterly humbled, forced to sue for a humiliating peace not once, but twice. First with Lucullus, and then with the ultimate Roman manipulator, Pompey the Great. Pompey, recognizing the immense logistical difficulty of permanently holding the entire mountainous kingdom, played a far more insidious game than simple conquest. He didn't erase the kingdom entirely. He knew the Parthians would simply take it the second Rome's back was turned. Instead, Pompey reduced Armenia to a vassal state, a permanent buffer, a perpetual stage for the inevitable conflict between Rome and its colossal eastern rival, the newly rejuvenated Parthian Empire. The King of Kings was allowed to retain his title, but his true sovereignty was gone, replaced by the suffocating reality of Roman oversight. Armenia now officially existed on the ultimate historical fault line. It was forced into a state of perpetual, agonizing oscillation, trapped in a vice grip where every single diplomatic move was a life-or-death gamble, decided in Rome or Ctesiphon. Rome would install a loyal client king. Parthia would immediately invade, drive out the Roman puppet, and replace him with their own candidate, usually a relative of the Parthian royal house. The survival of the Armenian state now depended entirely on impossible statecraft, the ability to appear weak enough to avoid full annexation, yet strong enough to be strategically necessary to both titans. The kingdom had achieved its incredible peak, only to realize that the view from the top was nothing but the horrifying sight of two empires sharpening their enormous claws. The struggle for national identity had now become a geopolitical horror show, played out on the bodies of Armenian soldiers. This was the dark beginning of the Arsacidid dynasty in Armenia, a branch of the very Parthians they had once ruled, cementing their fate as the eternal pivot point between East and West. The impossible survival story had just moved from the glorious battlefield to the desperate, terrifying diplomatic cage match, and the stakes could not possibly be higher. The air was thick, not with the dust of battle, but with the silent poison of political jealousy and the unbearable pressure of proximity. Armenia had survived the immediate diplomatic cage match, yes, but survival was merely a temporary reprieve, a breath held before the next drowning wave of imperial ambition. The colossal empire surrounding them, the relentless, iron-fisted Romans in the west, and the enigmatic, cavalry-rich Parthians in the east, did not respect borders. They only respected power, and they saw Armenia as a prize waiting to be plucked from the historical shelf. This was the geopolitical reality of the Armenian plateau. Perpetual siege, punctuated by brief, terrifying periods of impossible autonomy. But history, like the volatile earth beneath their feet, was about to shift seismically, promising not just autonomy, but utter, mind-bending dominance. From the shadows of complicated royal lineage and the dark corners of international diplomacy, a man was rising who would not just seek survival, but absolute, terrifying control. This was Tigranes II, the man the chronicles would soon call Metz the Great, a figure whose ambition was so vast it threatened to redraw the entire map of the ancient Near East. His arrival on the stage of history was not a gentle entrance. It was a thunderclap that echoed from the Aegean to the Caspian Sea, signaling the beginning of Armenia's golden, yet ultimately doomed, age of expansion. Yet his path to the throne was forged in literal chains. Tigranes had not been crowned in a gilded hall of ancient tradition. He had been held captive, a high-value political pawn, a royal hostage to the formidable Parthian king, Mithridates II. Imagine the psychological furnace of that existence. Years spent observing the intricate, merciless machinery of the empire that held him. Years spent learning their strategies, their weaknesses,
their very soul.
He was a student of the enemy, an unwilling observer in the belly of the beast, forced to absorb the art of conquest and statecraft from the masters of the eastern steppes, waiting for his solitary, desperate moment to reclaim his birthright. That moment came around 95 BC, when his father, Artavasdes I, passed from the scene.
To secure his release and claim the throne that was rightfully his, Tigranes had to make a sacrifice that would haunt the nation and become the ultimate motivation for his future wars. 70 valleys, strategically vital territories along the border, were handed over to the Parthian Shahanshah as ransom. It was a king buying his kingdom back with the very ground it stood upon, a crippling debt of soil and honor.
Tigranes knew, with the cold clarity of a man who had seen the inner workings of imperial greed, that to truly pay this debt, he wouldn't just need to take those 70 valleys back. He would need to dismantle the power of the Parthian Empire itself, stone by stone. He ascended the throne, and the world immediately felt the tremor of his resolve.
Tigranes did not hesitate. He initiated a campaign of breathtaking aggression, first consolidating his power internally, crushing rebellious nobles, and then turning his gaze outwards toward the petty kingdoms that lay ripe for the taking. He attacked and annexed Cappadocia, shattered the ruling structures of Media Atropatene, and secured the vital northern corridor leading to the Caucasus Mountains. His ambition was not merely defensive, it was apocalyptic in its scope, aimed at creating a new, singular empire, a terrifying buffer state so massive that no power, neither Rome nor Parthia, could ever ignore it again. By 83 BC, his armies had marched south and utterly crushed the Seleucid remnants in Syria, which had by that point descended into endless dynastic chaos, offering no meaningful resistance. Suddenly, Armenia was not just a plateau, it was a continental power, controlling access to the Mediterranean, the trade routes of Mesopotamia, and the wealth of the vast Persian interior. The map began to bleed purple under his relentless command. He swallowed client kingdoms whole, extending his domains deep into Cilicia, Phoenicia, and even parts of Judea. Tigranes the Great had established an empire where the sun literally never set on his vast territories, an entity so staggering it challenged the very notion of imperial balance. He claimed the ultimate title, the crown of crowns, the Basileus Basileon, King of Kings, a designation previously reserved only for the ancient Persian Achaemenids and later the Parthian rulers, a direct public challenge to every established imperial power in the known world. To house this impossible new empire, he commanded the construction of a capital city that would rival Rome itself in splendor, ambition, and sheer audacity. Tigranocerta. This wasn't just a military encampment or a renovated village. It was an architectural declaration designed to reflect his absolute, magnificent glory and the Hellenistic refinement he admired. He forcibly imported thousands of skilled Greek artisans, engineers, and architects,
relocating entire populations from conquered Greek cities, a move that infuriated the Roman allies, to populate this new metropolis. Imagine the spectacle: massive, state-of-the-art walls, opulent palaces designed to overwhelm the visitor, sprawling hunting parks that stretched for miles, and a grand theater built for Greek dramas, all carved out of the rugged, unforgiving Armenian landscape. It was a testament to pure, unbridled will and the belief that he was divinely destined to rule the entire East. For nearly 2 decades, Tigranes presided over this impossible golden age, a period of unprecedented wealth, military success, and geopolitical domination. The Armenian Empire was the new center of the world, intimidating both East and West. But this breathtaking, defiant expansion created an intolerable geopolitical vacuum on Rome's critical eastern flank. The Roman Senate, calculating, cold, and utterly ruthless, watched the rise of this Armenian titan with growing unease and mounting fury. The Romans, who viewed the entire Mediterranean basin as their personal pond, would never tolerate such a formidable, independent power blocking their inevitable eastward march to riches and dominance. They understood one critical truth that governed the ancient world. In the ultimate game of empires, borders are not lines drawn on parchment or negotiated in halls. They are lines drawn in blood, and Armenia had just drawn the widest, most defiant line of all. The stage was now set for the cataclysmic, world-altering confrontation with the Roman Republic, a clash that would either cement Tigranes as the greatest Eastern monarch in history or shatter the Armenian Kingdom entirely beneath the crushing weight of the Roman legions. Rome had waited long enough for the moment of reckoning, and the legendary general Lucius Licinius Lucullus, a man known for his military genius and unyielding ambition, was already marching east, bringing the inescapable hammer of the Republic down upon the diamond-hard empire of the Armenian King of Kings. The shadow of Rome was not a slow-moving cloud, but a lightning strike, delivered by the greatest military mind the Republic could offer in that desperate hour: Lucius Licinius Lucullus. When the news reached the colossal, freshly built ramparts of Tigranocerta, the glorious, unprecedented capital carved from the very rock of the Armenian plateau, it was met not with fear, but with a sneer. Tigranes the Great, the King of Kings, was at the absolute zenith of his power, ruling an empire that stretched from the Caspian to the Mediterranean, a diamond belt holding the ancient world together. He was arrogant, untouchable, and utterly blind to the nature of the beast that was now stalking his lands. Lucullus, hearing of the Armenian forces amassed against him, famously quipped that if they were envoys, there were too many; if they were soldiers, there were too few. This seemingly casual dismissal masked a lethal, focused intent. The Roman legions did not care about the size of an enemy, only its discipline, and they knew the difference between a professional killing machine and a vast, sprawling collection of levy troops bound together by the charisma of one king. Tigranes' first error was strategic lethargy.
He truly believed the impossible geography of the Armenian highlands was a shield stronger than any wall. He had not imagined that a Roman general would dare to bypass the traditional mountain passes, the heavily guarded choke points, and march straight through the hostile, unmapped wilderness of the Taurus Mountains toward his gleaming new capital.
But that is exactly what Lucullus did, driving his hardened legions through terrain deemed impassable, appearing at the gates of Tigranes like a phantom conjured by fate itself.
The city was a spectacle, a monumental testament to Tigranes' ambition, crammed with priceless treasures, Greek artists, and thousands of royal captives relocated from captured territories, a human prize waiting to be liberated by the approaching Roman force. The speed of the attack forced Tigranes' hand. He could not stand idly by and watch the symbol of his majesty fall. He called upon the full, terrifying might of his empire. Messengers rode out across the mountains, summoning the Medians, the Iberians, the tribes of the Caucasus, and the ferocious heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, whose armor was so dense they looked like moving statues of bronze and iron. The resulting army was colossal, perhaps 70,000 or 80,000 strong, though Roman accounts magnified the number to an unbelievable 200,000, a number Lucullus used brilliantly for propaganda, highlighting the scale of his impending victory. When Tigranes saw the Roman force deployed outside the city, a mere 10,000 to 15,000 men, he reportedly looked down from his royal position and scoffed. "If they are coming, they are too few to fight, and too many to run." This sentence was the epitaph of his glorious reign. The ensuing engagement, the Battle of Tigranes in 69 BC, was not a clash of equals, but an annihilation born of tactical genius meeting overwhelming hubris. Lucullus knew the strength of the Armenian host lay entirely in its fearsome cataphracts, armored from head to toe, capable of shattering any infantry line through sheer momentum. But he also knew their weakness. They were slow to turn, disastrously disorganized once momentum was lost, and their massive formations shielded inferior, poorly trained infantry levies. Lucullus executed a breathtaking maneuver. He detached a small reserve of cavalry to feign a retreat, drawing the terrifying cataphracts onto uneven ground, away from the main Armenian line. Then, with a speed that defied belief, the Roman main force bypassed the confusing melee, using the broken ground to conceal their advance, and struck the weakest point of the Armenian army, the eastern flank, manned by unreliable provincial troops. The Roman legions, operating like a single, disciplined organism, did not engage the terrifying cataphracts head-on. Instead, they charged the Armenian infantry, focusing their attacks on the horses of the armored cavalry, bringing down the terrifying knights and leaving them helpless on the ground. Panic erupted like a wildfire in dry summer brush. The sheer density of the Armenian army became its greatest liability. They could not maneuver.
They could not retreat effectively, and they began to stampede over their own ranks. The losses were staggering, a catastrophic blow that instantly dismantled the image of Tigranes' military invincibility. Tigrane, the pride of the East, fell shortly thereafter. The city was looted, its walls dismantled brick by brick. Its treasures, the accumulated wealth of a generation of conquest, poured into the Roman coffers. The Roman soldiers, now rich beyond measure, were suddenly convinced this campaign was worth the terrible march. But Tigranes did not break. This was the defining difference between the Armenian spirit and the fleeting courage of lesser kings. He had lost a battle, he had lost a city, but he had not lost his will to fight. He retreated into the unforgiving depths of the Armenian plateau, adopting a scorched earth strategy that was brutal but effective. He denied Lucullus forage, denied him supplies, and forced the Roman army to chase him deeper into a land that was about to turn against the invaders. The strategic aim shifted from a glorious conquest to a war of attrition against the greatest enemy Armenia possessed, its own climate and geography. Lucullus, intoxicated by his victory at Tigrane, pursued Tigranes toward the old royal capital of Artaxata, hoping to force a final, decisive engagement before winter arrived. He drove his troops relentlessly, but the vastness of the Armenian landscape, combined with the growing cold and the constant harassment from Armenian forces, began to erode the invincible morale of the legions. The Roman soldiers, having won their fortunes, began to question the wisdom of freezing and starving in endless mountain passes just so their general could gain one more triumphal arch. The seeds of mutiny were sown, fertilized by the cold and the exhaustion. Meanwhile, back in Rome, political enemies, notably the ambitious Pompey the Great, were already working to undermine Lucullus's command, ready to claim the glory for themselves. The Roman hammer had struck hard, shattering the jewel of the empire, but the diamond heart of Armenia refused to yield. The land itself was now fighting back, buying time for the King of Kings to rebuild his forces and prepare for the next, inevitable, and far deadlier round. The silence that followed the last great clash was not peace. It was the held breath of history, the terrifying quiet before the avalanche ripped the mountain apart. For years, the King of Kings, Tigranes the Great, had ruled an empire stretching from the Caspian to the Mediterranean, a landmass so vast it redefined the concept of regional power, a fleeting golden age built on audacity and iron resolve. But when you sit on the tectonic fault line of the ancient world, every victory is just a temporary lease signed in blood. The shadow that now fell across the vast Armenian high plateau was not from the east, the predictable fury of the Parthian horsemen, but from the west, the cold, calculating, and utterly relentless killing machine known as the Roman Republic. They did not send a minor general, a border governor looking for a promotion.
Rome understood the scale of the challenge that Armenia posed, the sheer impudence of a mountain kingdom daring to stand toe-to-toe with the inheritors of Alexander's domain. They dispatched Lucius Licinius Lucullus, a man whose ambition was matched only by his tactical genius, a man nicknamed the Pontic General for the way he ruthlessly dismantled Mithridates VI, Armenia's key ally and father-in-law to Tigranes.
Lucullus arrived with a mandate of total destruction. His forces, though often vastly outnumbered by the massive Armenian levies, were the professional killers of the age, marching with standardized precision, their shields locked, their short swords thirsty for close combat and quick, decisive victory. Their goal was simple, yet world-changing: dismantle the vast Armenian alliance structure and seize the legendary treasures stored within the kingdom's beating heart, its newly built capital.
Tigranes, blinded perhaps by the sheer magnitude of his own empire, had built his glorious new city, Tigranocerta, as a defiant symbol, a city of pure Hellenistic splendor, adorned with captured wealth and populated by forcibly resettled peoples from conquered lands. This was not just a city, it was an ultimatum etched in stone, a monumental challenge to Rome's cultural and political superiority in the Eastern Mediterranean. When Lucullus cornered the main Armenian forces near this very capital in 69 BC, the stage was set for a catastrophe that would define centuries. Tigranes, utterly confident in his overwhelming numbers, historians claim figures bordering on 200,000 men, facing a mere 15,000 Roman legionaries, viewed the small Roman force with arrogant disdain, allegedly declaring that if they were envoys, they were too many, and if they were soldiers, they were catastrophically too few. This hubris was the poisoned arrow that pierced the Armenian heart. The clash that followed near Tigranocerta was not a battle in the typical sense. It was a massacre, driven by Roman discipline and the catastrophic failure of Armenian command structure, proving that size alone means nothing against disciplined precision. While the Armenian heavy cavalry, the famed cataphracts, armored head to toe and terrifying engines of war, were sent to crush the Romans, their charge lacked coordination, breaking against the immovable, disciplined wall of the legionaries' shield formation. The Roman counterattack was brutal, swift, and absolute. Lucullus used the terrain and the high sun, capitalizing on the psychological shock of the cataphracts' failure, and employing a coordinated flanking maneuver that turned the battle into a panicked, bloody rout. Tens of thousands of Armenians and allied forces fell, and the jewel of Tigranocerta, that magnificent, defiant city, fell with them, plundered by the victorious legionaries who claimed unimaginable wealth in gold, silver, and slaves, sending a devastating message across the Eastern world. Tigranes the Great survived the immediate catastrophe, miraculously fleeing into the northern mountains where the unforgiving geography became his last, desperate shield against total collapse. But the war had shifted fundamentally. It was no longer a clash of empires on a grand battlefield. It was now a desperate fight for existence, a punishing guerrilla campaign waged in the high passes and deep valleys where the Roman legions, heavy and inflexible, could not maintain their operational tempo. Lucullus, for all his tactical genius, soon found himself strangled by the vastness of the land he sought to conquer, suffocated by the very geography Armenia had always relied upon. His supply lines stretched thin and vulnerable, constantly harassed by the remaining Armenian forces who knew every goat path and frozen stream, making every march a costly, bloody endeavor. The Roman soldiers, tired of chasing phantoms in the snow, tired of the relentless, unforgiving climate, began to mutiny, their desire for continued campaigning eroded by endless hardship and the diminishing promise of loot. The sheer impossibility of holding Armenia, the brutal reality of fighting a people who considered every rock a fortress and every blizzard an ally, proved to be Lucullus's ultimate undoing. Rome had to recall their victorious general, a stunning testament to the enduring, defiant resilience of Tigranes' broken kingdom. Lucullus was replaced, not because he was defeated on the field, but because he could not finish the job. He could not erase Armenia from the map, a task proving far more difficult than conquering the wealthy kingdoms of the Mediterranean coast. Enter Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, a name that echoed with even greater martial glory across the ancient world. Pompey arrived not just with soldiers, but with a refined strategy, combining overwhelming brute force with ruthless, pragmatic diplomacy, understanding that conquering Armenia was militarily and economically impractical. Neutralizing it was the only viable path forward.
Tigranes, now an old man, weakened by internal dissent, even his own treacherous son, the younger Tigranes, had defected to the Romans, seeking the crown for himself, faced the final reckoning, the true test of his long reign. The legendary King of Kings, who had once humbled the Parthians and defied Rome itself, was forced to make the ultimate, agonizing choice: complete destruction or calculated, state-preserving surrender. In a moment of profound, painful statecraft, Tigranes met Pompey not as equals, but as a humbled client, placing his royal diadem at the Roman general's feet in the ultimate symbolic act of submission to the new world order. Pompey, surprisingly, returned the crown, recognizing Tigranes not as a slave to be hauled through Rome, but as a necessary buffer state, a living wall between Rome's eastern frontier and the terrifying, ever-growing, highly professional power of the Parthian Empire. Armenia was stripped of its vast foreign conquests, reverting back to its ethnic heartland. But its sovereignty, its identity, and its crown remained intact. It was the survival of the state itself, achieved through devastating loss and brilliant last-minute diplomatic maneuvering, proving that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to die when the world expects you to be a corpse, ensuring the diamond heart of Armenia continued to beat against all the impossible odds. The year is no longer simply about holding the line. It's about surviving the seismic replacement of empires. Armenia had learned how to dance with the relaxed, decentralized Parthian Arsacids, often sharing a family tree and mutual enemies. But the ancient world was about to be reshaped by a terror far more focused, far more zealous, and absolutely intolerant of anything that wasn't Persian blood and Persian fire worship. This was not the amiable, Hellenized Parthia. This was the rise of the Sasanian Empire, a dynasty forged in the searing heat of ancient Iranian revivalism, dedicated to resurrecting the glory of the Achaemenids and stamping out every trace of foreign influence, especially in the strategically vital, culturally complex region of Armenia. The Sasanian kings, the Shahan Shahs, looked at Greater Armenia not as a buffer state, but as a runaway province that needed to be violently brought back into the fold of the Avesta and the purified faith of Zoroaster. They saw the Armenian Arshakuni kings as weak traders, contaminated by too much Hellenistic and Roman influence, and they demanded nothing less than absolute spiritual and political assimilation. This spiritual arrogance was far more dangerous than any mere military invasion, because it sought to erase the Armenian identity itself, forcing it into a homogenized Iranian mold. The tension became a burning wire across the globe's belly. The Romans, eternally pragmatic, saw the Sasanians as the first genuine existential threat since Carthage. And Armenia, the ultimate fortress, was the only thing standing between the Eastern Roman provinces and complete geopolitical chaos. If Armenia fell, the entire Roman East, Syria, Cappadocia, Asia Minor, was vulnerable to the tidal wave of Sasanian cavalry. And onto this stage of fire and blood stepped a man whose life would define the next 1,000 years of Armenian destiny, Tigranes III. Born into exile, fleeing the murderous chaos of Sasanian aggression, he was raised in the iron discipline of the Roman military machine, educated in Greek philosophy, yet still possessing the untamed mountain heart of an Armenian king. He was Rome's champion, the ultimate pawn, placed on the throne to act as a living, breathing shield against the Persian tide. But the crown he inherited was made of thorns and soaked in the blood of his ancestors, requiring a constant, brutal balancing act between two titans who wished him dead or compliant, never allowing him a single night of undisturbed sleep. Tigranes' early reign was a magnificent, exhausting saga of relentless warfare. He fought the Persians in massive, bloody campaigns across the high plateaus, winning legendary victories, pushing back the Sasanian tide through sheer force of will and the incredible resilience of the Naxarar cavalry, the elite noble horsemen who were the backbone of the Armenian military structure. These nobles, holding vast ancestral lands, were simultaneously the king's greatest strength and his most persistent political headache. They answered the call to arms with terrifying loyalty when the Persians crossed the border. Yet they constantly maneuvered against the central authority of the throne, ensuring the kingdom remained decentralized and prone to internal feuds. Bohemond, the ultimate pragmatist, understood that a direct assault could not succeed. Only treachery could breach the impregnable city. He began to search methodically for the weakness, the single human flaw in Antioch's mighty armor. And he found him. He found a man named Firuz, an Armenian renegade who had converted to Islam, and now guarded 3 of the colossal towers along the wall. Firuz hated his current masters, the Turkish emir Yagisiyan, and Bohemond discovered that this hatred ran deeper than his current loyalties. The negotiation was swift, silent, and deadly. Gold was exchanged, and a secret, terrifying plan was whispered into the night wind, a guaranteed path to open the gates, not through force, but through calculated, cold-blooded betrayal. The fate of the entire First Crusade, the fate of Jerusalem itself, the fate of a generation of Europeans, now hinged entirely on the greed of one renegade guard and the treacherous, desperate resolve of Bohemond of Toronto.